Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have Dan Shapir.
Hello from a warm and sunny Tel Aviv.
I'm Charles Max Wood from cold and rainy Utah from Top End Devs, and we have a special guest this week. That is Bruce Lawson.
How'd you do,
Bruce,
everybody?
welcome to the show. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm here from Birmingham, UK, and today we're celebrating our annual, my word, it's not raining day.
I was going to ask how often that happens, but you said annual, so I get the picture. Do you want to just remind people who you are? I'm pretty sure we've had you on the show before, but I don't remember what we talked about last time, and so...
For sure, yeah. Yes. I'm an old colleague of Dan's from when we both worked at Wix, which is quite a while ago now. I was in development in the late 80s, and then dropped out to travel the world and stuff, got into the World Wide Web because I figured it looked quite cool when I was a primary school teacher in Thailand, and then came back and got into web tech. So started mostly hassling people about specifications, trying to build things and saying this spec is incomprehensible, and eventually people got tired of me, so they would change the spec. And accessibility, making sure that your stuff works for people with disabilities, because it's important. And also performance. I'm not a performance nerd. I don't know every next step to implement CRUD, RUM, RUX, CRUX stuff that Dan knows. But having spent a great deal of my time in Asia, working and traveling and living, I know how it feels to have a crappy $50 Android device on a terribly constrained network and watch the loading spinner of doom just circle around when you're just trying to find out if you've missed your train or if it should be on the next platform. So these are things that matter to me. And I was here last time, I guess about 12 months ago. But who knows? I'm close to 100 and tempus fugit, so it could have been 3 weeks ago or 10 years ago. But I was here talking about some of the advocacy that I've been doing along with a dozen other developers across the globe, just normal developers, to try to make sure there's better browser competition on the mobile duopoly, i.e. Android and iOS. With a group called Open Web Advocacy. We've had quite a lot of success, or we have contributed to the success of getting legislation passed in Australia, most recently Japan, most notably the European Union, basically prohibiting Apple from only allowing Safari or its WebKit view-based browsers on iOS. The regulators have finally agreed with us and other interested co-lobbying partners, if you like, that it's actually holding the development of the web back if people can't use full-fat Firefox with Gecko inside, or full-fat Chrome /Vivaldi /Opera /Brave /Edge with Chromium inside. And it's been really, really eye-opening watching Apple squirm around and make themselves look pretty silly, actually, trying to evade regulation. It's been very noticeable that the traditionally highly pro-Apple press have become more and more frustrated or less willing to simply parrot Apple's party line, if you will. So, for example, here in the EU, I'm in the UK, so no longer in the EU, but in the EU, when the Digital Markets Act came into force, Apple tried to evade regulation by saying, well, you can't regulate Safari because Safari on iOS is different from Safari on macOS, which is different from Safari on iPadOS. And the EU declined to declined to believe them, pointing out that they're in their own marketing materials. Apple says 3 devices, 1 Safari.
But before we go there, and before we delve so deeply into the technicalities, I'd like to pull us back a little bit, because I want to relate something that I encounter very often with actual web developers. So obviously it's even, quote unquote, worse when you're talking to lay people. And it's the fact that when I say to web developers that you only have Safari on iOS, many times I hear a response like, "What do you mean? That's absolutely not true. I'm using Chrome on my iOS device. So what are you talking about?" So maybe you can clarify why it is that we insist on the fact that it's actually Safari and not really Chrome.
Sure, Dan. Yeah. Well, the clarification of why it is, you would have to ask Tim Cook about that. The reason we know it is because the App Store rules, Apple's App Store rules, say any app, and of course a browser is an app, any app that can browse the web must use Apple's WebKit view. So you can't even use your own fork of WebKit or a newer version of WebKit. It's the WebKit view that Apple ships inside the iThing that every browser must use as a rendering engine. And similarly, anything that can execute JavaScript in an app must use the analogous WebKit. I forget its name, but the
JavaScript core.
Thank you. Yes. Apple itself doesn't have to do this, but it requires it of anybody who ships an app that they want to put in the App Store. Why this should be? Apple will tell you it's for your comfort and security. I would say, and this is purely speculation because Tim Cook hasn't sent me a Christmas card for like years now.
But, what a jerk.
I know, and I haven't had Valentine's cards from the Safari team this year. But I would say it's very simple. If you could have Gecko or Blink, which is inside Chromium, inside your app, then it would have access to a lot more device APIs, etc., than you can access with Safari. And therefore, you would be able to ship a web app that was feature equal with a native single platform app that goes in the iOS App Store, for which Apple can extract a 30% rent. Simple as that. It seems to me. And if I were, Tim Apple, and richer than Croesus, but still demanding more money, I can see the logic in it. But the trouble is it's really inhibiting development of the cutting edge web apps, because if you could just ship one progressive web app that worked on Android, worked on Chrome OS, worked on Mac OS desktop, worked on Windows, worked on Linux, and worked on iOS, it would reduce development time a great deal. It might not be quicker to develop, but it's a lot quicker to ship out upgrades. You're not having to muck about with variant code bases and have separate testing teams. But of course, that would mean that it would be much more difficult for Apple to extract that 30%. And of course, the vision, their funny AR goggle things are not flying off the shelves. iPhone sales are down. I don't know how much they have how much they have to grovel to their shareholders, but they have bills to pay, and it makes sense they would be unwilling to relinquish the billions of dollars they get every year from this 30% rent extraction that they charge for people to put an app in the App Store.
So you mentioned progressive web apps. We've had people on our show to talk about this,
Mhm.
obviously. Alex Russell, for example, who I think even
Never heard of
invented.
him.
Yeah, you deny any knowledge. As I recall, he and his partner, I forget her name. I really
Francis.
Francis, exactly. I think they both coined the term together. Maybe
Yeah,
it's worthwhile explaining what progressive web apps are in case, because they are, thanks to Apple, they're not taking off as they should have. So maybe it's worthwhile to remind people what they actually are and what they're missing out on.
for sure. Yeah, a progressive web app it's a term. It's an umbrella term. It's like Ajax. It's a useful marketing term to describe a suite of different technologies working together. Years ago, Opera and Mozilla and Google got together, and we all had similar ways of being able to use web technologies to make what looked to be a desktop app, but it was Chromeless and installable on desktop. They were called widgets. A fella called Marcus Caceres, who worked for Opera at the time, now works for Apple, specified them in the W3C. But they didn't really take off simply because there weren't that many device APIs they could hook into at that point.
Just a comment though, you said Chromeless, just to emphasize that it's not about not being the Chrome browser.
I
It's
mean
about
the UI. Yeah, you just get a square box like a web view, effectively.
Yeah, you don't have. So when you're talking about Chrome, you're talking about like the search bar or the URL bar, and all that stuff. Okay.
Yeah, we're just talking like a window, effectively like an Electron app or a web view. And then,
that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And then devices, we got more and more device APIs. Geolocation was the first, and they've got loads of them now. Some are controversial, like Web USB. Some are not controversial, like the accelerometers.
Project Fugu, I think, is the project that brought a lot of these APIs to the forefront.
It did, although I want to give a shout out to Firefox OS, which pioneered a lot of them. They aren't necessarily now standardized in the format that Firefox OS did them, but Firefox OS did a lot of the work on
late lamented Firefox OS.
Yeah, it will still exist and going great guns in India under the name of Kaios. KAIOS. Yeah, I think it's the second biggest mobile operating system in India. But anyway, I digress. So a progressive web app is effectively a website plus. It is a web page just made of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, SVG. It has a manifest file, which gives it a long name, a short name that would show, if you installed it on your home screen, various different icons, what obviously iOS, Android, the late lamented Windows Phone have different icon sizes and formats. And then with a service worker, you can basically have a web app, a website that when a PWA aware browser goes to, the browser can say, hey, there's a manifest, there's a service worker, and it can say to the user, do you want to install this to your home screen? The user goes, yep. And then it becomes, a nice circular icon on your home screen that you can tickle into life with a magical twitch of your digit, just like any other app. It fires up full screen. It can work offline with a correctly written service worker, and to all intents and purposes, it's indistinguishable from a single platform Android or iOS app. But of course, Apple don't really like that because there's no way to monetize it. If brucelawson.co.uk wanted to have a PWA and Dan went there in his Android device, and his device would say, I wouldn't do any work. His device would go, hey, this is installable. Do you want to install it? He can. There's no App Store gatekeeper intermediary there. Apple would argue that that's bad because something's being installed onto your device and they haven't scanned it for security, they haven't scanned it for viruses, they haven't scanned it to make sure it doesn't contravene whichever crackpot Puritan wave of moral panic is sweeping Cupertino at this very moment. I would counter that and say the web has existed for 25 years. Browsers are really, really damn good at sandboxing. In fact, I think it was in something that Apple submitted to the UK Competition and Markets Authority, whom we've also been briefing, Apple admitted that browsers have a sandbox, quote, an order of magnitude more secure than that of the App Store. And we've seen at this very moment, there are sanctions busting Russian bank apps in the App Store. Their curation is not so great. I would argue that there are way too many identical fart apps in the App Store. I don't know. I mean, I'm an English guy, so farting is inherently fantastic.
I have teenagers, and it's funny.
It is funny, but I don't think you need more than 500 million of them, or however many there are. I suppose I'm saying that I personally don't buy Apple's argument that the world owes them 30% of the cost price of an app for their fantastic extra security and curation. I'm a grown up. Web browsers are brilliant and have been brilliant for ages at sandboxing tabs from each other, the OS away from rogue websites, because there's been rogue websites since Tim Berners-Lee rode a stegosaurus across the earth. So if people want to do this, I'm comfortable with it. However, the men in Cupertino in grey suits, they know better than me or you or anybody else in the world, and they prohibit it.
I just wanted to mention that from my perspective, the big three features that progressive web apps ideally provide that make the most significant difference are the fact that that, as you mentioned, it automatically can add an icon to the home screen. I mean, you can add icons to the home screen effectively for any web page, but it's a very manual and somewhat convoluted process, and most users, certainly my mother, doesn't know how to do it. So having it automatically suggest it makes all the difference in the world. The other one is, as you mentioned, is the fact that it's chromeless, that it covers the entire screen. That's really important when you're trying to create an actual app-like experience. And the final one is push notifications. Without the ability to have push notifications, that's like a deal breaker for a lot of organizations that want to have an app-like presence on a mobile device. There are obviously other features as well, but those are the big three from my perspective. And technically, they're totally doable. Google have done them on the Android phone. I mean, they work. Their progressive web apps work on Android. Apple has always managed to break at least one of these features. Like it's a sort of malicious compliance in a sense. They kind of work, and then they stop working, and then they work again, but some other one that used to work suddenly stops working. So it's you can't really seem to get all three of them to properly work on the iPhone.
This is correct, and the weird, the sad thing is that Apple have been getting much better with this. The WebKit team, who do a great job. I friends in the WebKit team, and I cannot believe for an instant that anybody who works in WebKit thinks I don't want my browser to be the best in the world. But even you two gentlemen at the dizzying pinnacle of your careers, we've all had managers that we've had to take orders from, but recently, Apple implemented web push. It's not perfect, but none of we three have ever had a bug, but there are developers who occasionally have written bugs and corrected them later. That's normal in software development. The Marcos Caceres, who I mentioned earlier, who used to work for Opera, then at Firefox, now he's at Apple, and he implemented the badging API. That's like the little red blob that you'd see if you had a progressive web app mail client, the way you can badge it to say there are X new notifications or X new emails. This is a UI thing that people like in single platform apps, and it came to the web. And then earlier this year, Apple just killed progressive web app functionality across the EU. Just killed it, just took it away, which caused considerable outrage. And again, I can't speak for them, but it's pretty easy to see that it was about 10 days before the Digital Markets Act was due to be enforced. It came into force, it came into law, but obviously you give people time to ramp up to it. So they were given a grace period. And the Digital Markets Act says that you cannot self-preference by giving your own stuff better access than a competitor's. So I can imagine
if you're a platform maker.
Yes, if you're a platform maker of over a certain size, and you have to, it's like 400 million euros a year, X thousand users. So I can imagine Bob Suit, as I like to call him, in Cupertino, sitting there and thinking, okay, so we're going to have to let other browsers do progressive web apps because Safari can. Well, what happens if the day before this comes into force, we completely kill progressive web apps, even from our own products, because then we're not self-referencing, which if you are Bob Suit, that probably makes great sense. But luckily in OWA, Open Web Advocacy, we somebody noticed that this was just didn't exist anymore in a beta. People asked, and the Safari bug trackers, the forums, have you deliberately broken PWAs on the beta? And there was silence. So we organized basically a campaign of developers and business owners across the EU to email the people who are in charge of enforcing the Digital Markets Act to say, in 10 days' time, the progressive web app that my business makes and depends upon is going to break irrevocably and completely. And this will be the business effect. We only had like a week, and bless them, bless everybody who did it. Hundreds of people wrote to the EU. There were businesses, little progressive web apps that would tell people if a kindergarten was going to shut down early for any reason and alert people that was going to break. There were small community things that would giving each other oncology advice and support that was going to break. A friend of mine runs heavily privacy-focused note-taking progressive web app that nothing you do ever leaves your device. There's nothing stored in iCloud, nothing goes out. It's all on your device. And that was heavily used by EU journalists reporting behind on the front lines of the Ukraine war. And this was going to break in 10 days. There was no way of telling these people because they were out of, it wouldn't be safe to be connecting to Twitter and announcing your location. So there was no way to tell these people, for Pete's sake, save your data because this is going to be just completely kiboshed in a week. Hundreds of people wrote to the EU, and the EU Who knows what they said to Apple, but Apple backtracked. So now in the EU, progressive web apps still exist, but at the moment, they can only use the WebKit engine, which is obviously not even in malicious compliance with the Act. That is contravening the Act. So the EU opened an investigation. And, it's a massive change that's been requested from Apple, and I've been in software since Dan, since you were in short trousers. I've been working in software. I have to say, viewers, that before we started, he got up and closed the door, and he's in short trousers.
I still occasionally wear short trousers to the consternation of my kids.
So,
well, you were talking about teaching primary school in Thailand in the late 80s, and I was in primary school in the late 80s. So anyway,
but I've been in software forever, and I know that changing a massive system, even when you've had to, they only had 6 months formal grace period, but Apple must have known 2 years ago when the DMA was announced that it was going to be considered to be a primary gatekeeper. But even so, I can understand that you can't do everything in 2 years. And I'm sure, I can't speak for the EU. I've spoken to them many times, as of Apple, as of lots of other advocacy organizations. That's not a secret. But I am certain that the EU don't want court cases and fights. What they want is a more competitive landscape. And if that means saying to Apple, look, okay, for 6 months more, you can do what you're doing, as long as you promise to get it right, rather than rushing through a half-assed fix or just nuking stuff like you did with PWAs. I get that. I want a better environment. I don't want Apple to go down in flames. I want Apple to go, actually, it's better for everybody if Safari competes on its own merits. It's better for everybody.
So the thing that there are a couple of things, and I'm trying to figure out how to state some of this stuff. Because on the one hand, I definitely feel because I have an iPhone, right? I have an iPhone.
So for testing.
Right. But, and so I feel this, right? Because ultimately I use Brave browser, but Brave browser is more or less a reskinned Safari browser, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's using WebKit. It's using all of those things. If I'm building some other application, lately I primarily do Ruby on Rails, and then I do a lot of front end stuff. And so that's where I get into JavaScript and web. That's relevant to most of our listeners here, right? But one thing that I've gotten into is the team at Basecamp provides Turbo Native, right? Which gives kind of a clean Chromeless wrapper around your Ruby on Rails app or other web app. And so you can essentially build a PWA, but your native app is your web app.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I feel this because there are some problems that I'd really like to solve with a PWA or with specific features that go into a PWA. And when they don't do what you need them to do, that really sucks.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other end, I am not a big fan of government intervention, right? And so I'm looking at it and I'm going, okay, well, Apple's a private company, and they, when you buy the iPhone, you're kind of signing up for whatever they do or don't do. iOS will do or not do whatever it wants. There's a walled garden here, right? Because you have to submit apps to the App Store and get them approved. And it may or may not play nicely with some of this other stuff. And so as much as I want Apple to be doing this stuff, I am a little bit allergic to the government telling them they have to do this stuff. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, if I can say something about this, Chuck, I think what a lot of people miss, and unfortunately it's often people in the US especially, is the fact that if you want, what you actually want is a free market. And your concern about government intervention is the fact that they are potentially getting in the way of a free market. The problem is that when you have a monopoly, you don't
Yes.
have a free market. And you might say, well, Apple is only like half the market. They're not a monopoly. I can always decide to purchase an Android device instead. But the reality is that they are a monopoly because I can't not support iOS as a company that delivers some sort of a service. If I'm so for the web, the mobile web constitutes something between 70 and 80% of web browsing.
Yes.
And if my web app doesn't work on iOS, then I'm basically out of half that market.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something that any company could deal with. Now, look at what happened with what's that game manufacturer, the ones that create Fortnite, and all.
I can't remember. I don't play games.
I don't either. I don't remember. I haven't played Fortnite.
They had that big row with Apple over the App Store rules.
Epic
They're
Games,
also
I think.
Epic Games, I think.
Is it Epic?
And they're like the biggest game manufacturer in the world, and it was and they're basically losing this fight in a lot of ways. So what chance does the little guy have? It's kind of like, think about the days of the railroads. It's like you have to have some sort of regulation here, or the little farmers get run out of their lands.
Mm-hmm.
And this is literally what it is. It's Apple taking advantage of the monopoly that it's been able to create. Now, again, I'm not saying that Apple should not be a successful company, or that they invent to a great extent invented this space. Good on them. It's that the fact that there needs to be some sort of a mechanism that protects the free market, because in a totally unregulated capitalistic environment, you don't end up in a free market. You end up in a series of monopolies controlling everything.
What Dan said, I mean, I'm perhaps not as allergic to government as many American people are, because unfortunately, when you were a colony, we didn't govern you terribly well. Terribly sorry about that. But I am.
It's okay. I'm happy with where we ended up in a lot of ways, so it's fine.
But I am allergic to government intervention in tech, because I work a lot in accessibility, and I've seen attempts by governments to regulate, and of necessity, regulation is law, and it takes a long time to be passed and come into force, and by which point you might have frozen into law a technique which is 2 years older and much worse than the technique now, but which is why the EU and the UK laws, or the regulators, everything they write is about opening up competition, preventing people from self-preferencing. It doesn't mention, it doesn't say you must allow this API. I mean, I like the fact that now in the EU, every new device must come with USB-C, so you don't have hundreds of different proprietary chargers. But the problem is, what happens when USB-D, E, and F come about, which are much better, but the legislation only allows USB-C? I get the problem, Chuck, but certainly this legislation is designed to promote a level playing field. It's not. I don't want to penalize Apple. I'm talking to you with on a hugely expensive MacBook Pro that cost considerably more than my first car ever did, and you'll prize it out of my cold dead hands. But if I had to give up one thing, and it was the MacBook Pro or the open web, you can have my MacBook Pro. I really want the open web to win. And I think anyway, your argument ended in, was it the 50s or the 60s, when the AT&T was broken up, and so
Right.
it became
And-
obvious that nobody
Yeah.
could own the telephone network and be the sole supplier of telephones.
Right.
It was an abuse, and it was distorting the free market. It wasn't, because every company of necessity tends to monopoly. Every company wants to raise its market
of course.
share, and the logical end of raising your market share is owning 100% of the market.
So
I mean, I would love to fix capitalism, but I don't think I have enough years left in me to do that. But certainly, certainly helping. What we've been doing at OWA is helping the CMA and the EU and the Japanese and the Australians understand the competition ramifications of what are pretty erudite, esoteric things like, well, if they don't allow this API, and I will say, I expected when I first met these people who are lawyers and economists, I expected lots of elderly men in dusty wigs going, well, what is a computer? But actually, it hasn't been that at all. I wish my grasp of economics and law were anything like as quick as their grasp has been of the technical issues we've shown them. I mean, just recently, I know, a 70-page report on in-app browsers. This isn't Apple bashing at all. This is bashing all in-app browsers. And I'll tell you what,
In-app browsers are the tool of the devil.
That if I'd been allowed to write the executive summary down, that is pretty much the synopsis I would have written, but I wasn't allowed it. I'm just allowed to turn up at the meetings and look beautiful.
Right.
But yeah,
I just want to jump in on some of this because to a certain extent, I agree with you guys, right? Monopolies are anti-capitalist. We also see crony capitalism where, some of these tools get used on behalf of companies that then kick back money to the politicians that did them the favors. Some of these tools are open to that kind of abuse. And so when it comes right down to it, I mean, if it truly is anti-monopolistic, there's a long word for you. I'm happy to support some of that. I get a little bit concerned because in case folks haven't listened to the show and haven't heard me, I try and keep the politics out of this, but I am very involved, especially in the state of Utah with our political system and our politicians. And I'm actually the vice chair of the Utah County Republican Party. So I'm in it all the time. But my concerns mostly come down to, because what you're talking about, I agree with, right? It's like, hey, let's open this up, let's let everybody play in the space, right? But the concern is are there unintended consequences? Are there things that are going to come out of this that we don't want? And then the other concern that I have, and it's hard to know those things, right? And so it's kind of not an argument against this, but at the same time, I want to make sure that as much as we can foresee what may come out of this. And then the other thing is if we're creating the tools for government to do these kinds of things, right, pass these kinds of regulations and then enforce them, as I've said, most of my allergy to government intervention comes from they find some other way to turn this into something else that we don't want. And so when we're looking at this, right, we have to be very careful and say, okay, look, we're allowing you to regulate these things under these very narrow areas so that, we can open the market so that you don't have a monopoly without allowing them to be abused on behalf of, well, my buddy's the CEO of such and such a company. And so, there are competitors, a monopoly now too. And so now I'm going to treat them like I'm treating this other company. And to your other point, though, yeah, I don't feel like anybody's necessarily trying to pick on Apple per se or try to hurt them. But anyway,
I'd like to say one thing about that, or a few things about that. First of all, from my experience, like I dislike politicians significantly. It's not it's not a big leap given that I'm in Israel, but we've seen that tech companies and tech company CEOs are usually a lot smarter, more efficient, and wield more power than your average politician.
Fair.
And
that's also a concern.
And think about, let's take a different example. Like, think what would happen if Google in their search engine decided to, basically remove your company or your organization out of the search results, the impact that would have.
They do that to a certain degree.
And they do that to a certain degree. And the fact that they can is more scary than almost anything else. Think about the fact that the ranking algorithm for TikTok is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Like, I'm not saying that they decide on the rank of any video, but they decide the ranks of the videos that they specifically like or dislike. So they certainly have their finger on the what's it called? The
like button.
Yeah,
the recommendations and yeah.
So and think on the impact that has on the opinions of people. Now, in this particular case that we're speaking about in the context of Apple, that seems to be purely about revenue and not about ideologies or stuff like that. But still, they are creating a situation that is effectively killing the open web. And as people who are proponents of the open web, that's a problem. And it seems like, I would love for there to be a different mechanism, that government intervention to fix this, but I'm not seeing any such mechanism available.
And we have been appealing to Apple for a decade, appealing to their better nature. I personally, I don't want. Some people hate Apple. Some people hate Google. I'm too old for hating. I don't want anybody to be taken down in flames.
Right.
I don't want Apple to involve themselves and us in a decade-long series of malicious compliance until they eventually go, oh, all right then. Because, of course, for a monopolist, any delay is profit. So that's just a given. They will have to do this stuff, but they have every fiscal every fiscal incentive is towards dragging it out with mucking about with going to court about procedure, as they've done in the UK recently. That's a given. But what I really want is for Apple to do the right thing. People have accused me of, oh, well, you just want the world to be Chromium. Like, no, that's absolutely not what I want. And in fact, I love Firefox, but it's been losing now for years and years.
Yeah.
What I really want is Safari to run on iOS, iPadOS, if that's a different thing, Android, Windows, Linux, Chromebook, as well as Mac OS, because WebKit runs on all those things. And Safari used to be on Windows. I would love to see Safari running on all of those things, giving Chromium a run for its money, being a competitor to Chrome, because there's only one organization that has brand loyalty, a marketing budget, technical nous, worldwide prominence to be able to compete against Google, and that is Apple. So I really want Apple to set my friends and colleagues in the WebKit team free to compete, so we could see 50. If it were 40% Safari, 40% Chrome, 10% Firefox and Brave and Vivaldi and Opera. I would much rather it was equal shares each, but I'm a realist. I would much rather it be a better balance. So this would allow that. I also know many of the WebKit team personally, and they're some of the brightest people I've ever met. I'm sure that they're frustrated.
I guess my point is that, because I think I agree with you guys, especially in this case, but we have to be careful where we apply the hammer and how big a hammer we use.
I completely agree. And luckily, I mean, I guess it's the same in the States as well, but the EU is an entity, but 27 different, was it 26 countries now get to vote on stuff. So in the same way as the States, you've got lots of different states of competing cultures and concerns and imperatives. So you have in the EU, it's cumbersome, but it means there's checks and balances built in. And
I would also argue
you have people, you have everybody thinking about it and coming at it from their own angle, and it makes it better.
Yes.
Yeah, I would also argue that in the power dynamics, the $1 trillion company probably has more power than a couple of farts arguing about this thing in some pub somewhere.
With 3 farts. With 3 farts, Dan.
Are we back to that fart app or the 50,000 fart apps?
Yeah. But what you say about crony capitalism is quite interesting, Chuck, because we have to remember as well that Google paid Apple $20 billion to be the search provider on iOS. So the idea that these are
that's not cronyism so much as you see them supporting campaigns of politicians.
I said chromiism. Yeah. I didn't say chromiism. I'm just, but people try and paint it as a sort of battle between these two behemoths, like Alien, Predator, Godzilla versus the other one. It's much more nuanced than that.
Totally.
Going back to what Dan said earlier, lest people. what normal person cares about regulation, but. In the EU, the people who are designated as gatekeepers, it's not only Apple and Google. Whichever company runs TikTok, ByteDance, is it? Yeah. They are a gatekeeper. Whatever Facebook's called today is a gatekeeper. It is an attempt to stop any of the major digital players distorting the market. To allow smaller companies to compete fairly. I think that's a good thing. It can't be perfect.
Absolutely.
Nothing's perfect, apart from me.
We're kind of getting toward the end of our time, and I just want to nail things down. So with Open Web Advocacy, is that the mission then, to open up the web space to competition? Or is it these particular fights? Or how does that work?
We want to be able to make web apps that will work cross-device, because the web is a mature platform. It works everywhere now. It should work everywhere now, but it's been prevented from working everywhere now. So we want to be able to make web apps. And that's because we're developers. None of us are. I know far more about regulation than I ever wanted to know. A couple of us had a company in China and couldn't use iPads because one particular API is only allowed on a native app. It's not allowed from Safari, but it could use Android, and that was a problem. I got tired of making a PWA and having to wrap it up in capacitor or something like that to go into the App Store. It was just an unnecessary extra step, which meant periodically I had to download 48 exabytes of something called Xcode in order to cajole it to do something which was completely unnecessary. other people, they want to write web apps because they work for smaller companies that don't have a colossal budget. To a Google, to a Microsoft, to a Netflix, to a Wix, it's not that expensive to have a team who test iOS, a team who test Android, maybe a React Native team, and then other people to walk around with buckets to collect those people's tears every time they have to use React Native. But to a smaller company, that's prohibitively costly.
Oh, Bruce.
Yeah, down the nights where we first met, we used to have to empty the buckets out over the wall into the port.
Yeah, they were well compensated for their tears, though.
Yeah, and that's another thing. To smaller companies, hiring loads of people who are React Native devs is a lot more expensive than hiring people who are competent HTML, CSS, and JavaScript devs. And also, you don't have to pay for $99 a year for a developer license. You don't have to have a Mac and an iOS device and an iPad for testing if you're a web developer. Most of us do, but it's not required simply to put pixels on a screen.
So
that's our mission.
Gotcha. So because it's, all the things you're talking about, right? With having things work everywhere or mostly everywhere, and, be able to move forward without worrying about having to be compatible with the lack of things in a Safari or similar. What do we do? Like, so me, developer dude working my day job, right? What can I do then to make this work? Or what can my company do, right?
I suppose in the States, what you could do is perhaps rein back your personal aversion towards government regulation, because I know you've got that DOJ versus Apple thing coming up. I don't know the details of that because American regulation it's too much for my tiny brain with 50 states and
I don't know if anybody follows all of it.
It's basically to educate yourself. There's a lot of people for whom Apple are still a sort of shining beacon of all things good. That's being tarnished quite a great deal, and many people are, but you'll also find many people aren't. And as Dan said, there's even web developers. A couple of months ago, somebody said to me, I had no idea that Chrome on iOS was not the same as Chrome everywhere else. It's like, you're a web developer, dude.
Right.
So you just tell people, make them aware that there are other things in the world than iOS and Android native apps.
So then,
is there a way people can actually actively support the web advocacy group?
You could, yes. You can retweet or retweet our stuff, or even re-LinkedIn our stuff.
We're back to the fart apps again.
I'm British. A couple of the people on the team are devoted full time on this, so you could, if you want to, help pay their salaries. I'm not salaried. I do this because it's a mission, but and also these guys couldn't work because it was COVID time, and so they spent many hours writing the reports and drawing the graphs, etc. You can support them, but basically what you can do is just support people who are talking about this. And if you live in a country like Brazil, Korea, India, Israel, places where you have regulators that could be doing something about this because you're a big market, whether like Israel, you're a rich developed economy, or somewhere like Brazil, you are a rich developed economy, but you're also massive. Ask what your regulators are doing about this.
Yep.
Write a blog post.
I guess this kind of, writing a blog post and being informed as to who's working on it. You said also to educate yourself, and so I was wondering, Open Web Advocacy Group. You sounded like you were putting out reports and statistics and things like that. So where do people find that stuff? And are there other organizations that are putting out good information too, so that I can get informed?
There's other organizations, yeah, completely unaffiliated from us. There's Tim Sweeney from Epic Games, who writes a lot of stuff about this. DHH from 37 Signals, whatever they're called. I disagree with him about mostly everything, but on this stuff, I don't disagree with him at all. But again, hopefully that shows people that this is fundamentally a technical issue that we're having to fight through regulators, because there's no other venue. It isn't socialists versus free marketeers. It isn't a communist versus libertarian thing. It's a technological issue that individually we developers haven't been able to persuade the bad guys at Google and Apple and previously Microsoft to amend their ways. And the only people who are bigger are governments, even if in many ways they're not bigger than a $2 trillion company. It shouldn't have come to this. It's a shame that it's come to this, but it has. And we are where we are. And just spreading the word around, amplifying our voices, helping out where you can. There will be other fights in the future, like the 10 days till PWAs die, when we basically had a team of volunteers just keeping the website up, designing and coding up a website in record time, sifting through submissions that came through our form and forwarding them onto the EU, making sure we didn't forward stuff on with confidential information, for example. You can drop in and help us out from time to time, or you can help pay those two guys' salaries.
All right,
or
good
just,
deal.
Just cross your fingers and hope we win. If you can't do anything else, just moral support's good too.
Yeah. Is there a website for the group?
openwebadvocacy.org. Open-web-advocacy.org. Yes, it's a mouthful, but we invented it before we really thought through any social media strategy. It literally was two guys in Australia emailed a mutual friend saying, do we know anybody in the UK who'd be prepared to go to the UK regulator to make them aware about PWAs? Because the UK were thinking Android versus iOS. And we wanted to say, well, actually, there's this third way that works everywhere. And the mutual introduced me to these two guys. I introduced them to a friend of mine called Stuart, who's a drinking friend down the pub. We've worked together on and off for 15 years. We set up a little group. It's grown organically. Everybody is just a developer. There's no... Most of us have never met in real life. We're just people who want to make sure that the web has a future across all devices for everybody. As Sir Uncle Timbo himself said, this is for everyone.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do our picks. Hopefully people are getting some ideas on how they can help out with this. And these are changes I'd like to see. And anyway, Dan, do you want to start us off with our picks?
Yes, why not? Not a lot of picks this time, a few technical ones. So it turns out that there were two, as of the time of this recording. Oh yeah, there's actually one thing which isn't exactly a pick, but it's a bit of news. Today was my first day at the new company that I work at. Last week, I left Next Insurance after 2.5 years there. I only have good things to say about them, but it was time for me. And now I've joined as the principal engineer at a company called Sisense. It's a company that does data intelligence and data analytics and stuff like that, creating all sorts of tools and services. They are working on providing their tools as an SDK that can be embedded within others' services and solutions and whatnot. And I'm to be a principal engineer on that project. So I'm very excited about that. And like I said, today was my first day. I was there at the office, and it was great. So that's kind of a pick.
Congratulations.
Congrats,
Thank you.
Dan. Can't
Yeah.
believe you've been at Next for 2.5 years. It feels like you only just joined. Wow, man, we're getting old.
No,
Yeah,
Sisense is next. Next was last.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, so the few technical picks as well. The first one, so there were a couple of conferences last week as of the time of this recording. There was Google I/O, which is Google's big technical conference, and also at more or less the same time there was ReactConf, where Bruce's favorite framework shows off its new developments and capabilities. And I'm kidding. But there were a couple of interesting things that were released, and I would like to mention two of them. So over at Google I/O, my friend Barry Pollard presented at Google I/O for the first time. We have had him on the guest on the show. He's a great guy. And he spoke about what's it called? It's called the name escapes me right now. It's a thing called speculation rules. It's a way to specify within the HTML itself which other pages and resources should be pre-fetched, preloaded, and even pre-rendered. Now, some of these capabilities have sort of existed before as resource hints, but this mechanism is much more sophisticated and generally all around better. And what it enables are websites that appear to load instantly. Especially if you're building a multi-page application, you can achieve a performance when navigating between pages that's on par and potentially even better than single-page applications, which is really great. So, and when you couple that with other technologies like view transitions and stuff like that, I think we're going to be seeing an MPA renaissance, potentially. It will be interesting to see. So that would be my first pick. And there's, so as I said, the link to that talk would be my first pick. My second pick is a talk from ReactConf. Well, actually, it's a talk about the technology presented at ReactConf. It's from our friend Jack Harrington, used to be a host on React Roundup. He has this channel on YouTube called Blue Collar Coder, where he presents a lot of technologies, web technologies, and gets into the nitty-gritty. And he did a video and going in depth on the new React compiler. And this is an interesting technology that basically kind of optimizes your React code. So you write React code as most developers do, which is kind of inefficient. And then that mechanism kind of turns it into fine-tuned, highly efficient React code. At least that's the goal. And I will add that I'm trying to get the relevant React people to come on the show to talk about that technology because I think it's really interesting. So Jack's video is my second pick for today. And my final pick is because, Bruce, at the very beginning of this show, you mentioned the fact that you used to work on standards. And whenever I think about standards, I'm always reminded of the design notes section in the HTML spec, the actual spec for HTML itself. And I'll read this part because it's worth reading out every once in a while. And it goes as following. It must be admitted that many aspects of HTML appear at first glance to be nonsensical and inconsistent. And I stress this is from the HTML spec. HTML, its supporting DOM APIs, as well as many of its supporting technologies, have been developed over a period of several decades by a wide variety of people with different priorities who, in many cases, did not know of each other's existence. Features have thus arisen from many sources and have not always been designed in an especially consistent ways. Furthermore, because of the unique characteristics of the web, implementation bugs have often become de facto and now de jure standards, as content is often unintentionally written in ways that rely on them before they can be fixed. Despite all this, efforts have been made to adhere to certain design goals. These are described in the next few subsections. So this is such a great piece. This is such a great piece of content to put in the actual HTML spec, and I really love it. And this candidness and forthrightness about the state of things as they are, which doesn't in any way decrease the fact that the web itself is one of the greatest achievements of the human race, in my opinion. And those would be my picks for today.
I'm going to butt in as a guest and make a pick because
butt away, man, butt away.
Fart again, I see. One of the things you said, Dan, one of those design principles that passage alludes to is when you're writing the specs, it's called the priority of constituencies, and it says you always considered users over web authors, over implementers, over theoretical purity. So in other words, the people who count most are the end users, and the next most important constituency are developers, and then the next most constituency are browser manufacturers, and only then it's theoretical purity. And my picks are web standards picks. I'm the frontiest of front-end guys. Dan mentioned them earlier. Multi-page view transitions are coming soon to shipping Chrome. This is for multi-page application, or what we old-timers call a website with lots of different URLs. You'll be able to transition between them without the page going white and refreshing. And again, it's just bringing a UX feature from the world of apps to the web without all the nonsense of having to try to do SPAs. It's going to be a game changer.
We actually had Noam Rosenthal, who's the guy who's working on this spec, as a guest on this show, talking exactly about view transitions. I don't remember the number of the episode, but we should probably link to it.
Yeah, love me a bit of Noam Rosenthal. He was at Wix when
beyond. Does this go beyond sort of the HTMX or Turbo approach?
It has nothing to do with that. It's basically you can specify in CSS and HTML. You need potentially a little bit of JavaScript, but ideally just HTML and CSS. You can create animated transitions between pages when you're navigating.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So think about app experiences when you're clicking something and like a Netflix type experience or an Amazon type experience. When you're clicking, let's say, something in Netflix and that thing expands, like you're going into a specific movie and that item expands to cover. So it's not like you don't see that transition. It kind of animates from one page to the next.
Oh, okay.
And it's a game changer because somebody who comes with a browser that doesn't yet support view transitions, it just works as before. Nothing breaks. So nobody gets a worse experience than they do now, and gradually everybody gets a better one. There's also newly come to Baseline, which is a new initiative. I don't know whose initiative it was, but you see it all over the place on MDN. Baseline is a category of stuff that, as a jobbing web developer, you can expect to be supported. So it's sort of if it's in Baseline, I can use it. That's what I tell people when I'm mentoring. Newly in Baseline is the has pseudo class, which allows you to say, if this form has an input that is invalid, put a red line around the whole form or something.
Oh, interesting.
A parent selector, that's everywhere now. It's much more than a parent selector. In fact, I just wrote a blog post an hour before we joined about why I call has the God selector, because it's omnipotent and awe-inspiring. There's also in baseline the popover API. That's when you can say, here's a button, popover target equals foo, and a div ID equals foo, and without any JavaScript at all, when you hit that button, foo will pop up. By default, it's centered vertically and horizontally. You can, with CSS, you can give it an opaque backdrop. You can do anything with it that you can do in CSS. When you hit the button again, the popover disappears. It's also got light dismiss with the ESC key built in, just given to you for free for browsers. And that's everywhere now. So I've been using that a great deal in a recent project. And coming soon to CSS is masonry layouts. And there's been really interesting conversations between WebKit and Chrome about different ways to achieve this. Each party believes that it's necessary to add to the web platform, but there are differences of opinion about how it should be implemented. Is it a kind of grid? Is it a layout method of its own? I'm too stupid to know what's right or wrong, because it's all about how hard it is to implement in browsers, etc. Excuse me. But what I really like is the conversations between all the interested parties, because not only is it really well thought out, people are arguing their case, but in a really mannered, decent way. But all along, people are saying, if we do it that way, that's too complicated, and it doesn't even matter if masonry is supported at all if developers don't understand it. They're always thinking along that priority of constituency. If we make it easy for us as browser manufacturers, do we make it too hard for developers to actually do the thing we're trying to allow? And it's just a really great GitHub issue of, yeah, but what about this? Maybe you're right. What about this? I'm absolutely convinced that they're going to arrive at the best solution. I don't know what it is, because these people have mighty brains, but it's so refreshing to see. So those are
also
my
anchor positioning is also coming, which is
coming
great.
soon. Yeah. Do you want to describe what that is, Dan?
As I recall, it's basically the ability to, in a smart way, position elements relative to one another. So, for example, we were talking about popovers, and you want the popovers to be positioned relative to some other element on the page. You can use anchors in order to achieve it. You know, we spoke about the fact that both...
So like a tooltip instead of a motor.
Yeah.
And it will be properly positioned within the
Right.
viewport, which is really hard to do. And by the way, you know, as Bruce mentioned that both he and I worked at Wix, like half of Wix code, tons and tons of code, was about implementing behavior, kind of like anchor positioning, in using just JavaScript and CSS, the current JavaScript and CSS. So theoretically, it could get rid of half of Wix's code. So I'm really excited about that. And another thing that I think Carson Gross from HTMX mentioned when he was on the show, the ability to move elements in the DOM without resetting them. So think about the fact that you can move a video from one page to another, from one part of the page to another part of the page, and the video will continue playing and not reset itself to the beginning of the video, stuff like that. Really, a lot of exciting things are happening and making the browser and the web itself much more of an application platform without needing to resort to really sophisticated frameworks.
And also without having to resort to crusty old component libraries. I was doing some research for my last job, and I looked at 3 different component libraries which had an accordion component, which were full of crusty JavaScript that wasn't listening to it wasn't checking whether you were hitting space or enter to open a thing, and wasn't setting all the accessibility properties correctly. For the last 5 years in HTML, we've had the details element where this is just given to you with all of the accessibility mappings built into the browsers for free. It's time, if you haven't looked at the component libraries you're using for a couple of years, it's time to have a look and see how much of this stuff you can retire, because it's technical debt on yourself, and it's more for your user to download, so it's hurting performance.
Yeah, I discovered the details. So I was working on an application for my client, and they said, "Wouldn't this be easier in a details element?" And I was like, "What's that?" And I went and looked it up, and I was like, "Oh, damn, I'm not writing this ever again, ever again."
And I'll tell you what, Chuck, I live and breathe HTML. I can't blame anybody for not following it because so much is going on in the
Yeah.
Open Web standards. And one of the reasons why I finished my last gig and starting a new one next month is that I got tired of filling my brain with stuff about Node and Docker and all the ephemera of build process and deployment process, and it was blocking my ability to actually understand what was being given to me for free. I just couldn't absorb the information, so I've chosen to go back to my roots and just go back to the frontiest of the front end stuff.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of cool stuff coming to the web platform, so maybe we should see if we can use it everywhere. That'd be real cool.
And we go round in a back to where we started, like an Ouroboros of love.
Right. I'm going to jump in with my picks real quick. We're already past time. There's another call I wanted to get on. It's a webinar presentation thing, so it's running without me, which is fine. But anyway, no, this is fascinating stuff. I don't have a problem sticking around for a few minutes. But my picks, so I usually do a board game pick. And so I'm going to pick a game called Death Eaters Rising. If you've read or watched the Harry Potter movies, read the books, effectively, it's a game where you build a team of wizards to fight off Voldemort's rise. And so Voldemort shows up about halfway through the deck. You stick him in halfway through, and then you just play until he shows up. And then if you've defeated enough Death Eaters, then you can defeat Voldemort. And you play it with the cards, and the wizards can all take damage, and you can heal each other. And anyway, it's a fun game. And so you have your team, and you're working together with the other players that have their teams. Board Game Geek weights it at 2.73 or 2.37. Sorry. So that's pretty approachable. It's a little bit on the complicated side for people who are just casual gamers, but you can definitely pick it up, and it's a fun game. You can play it 2 to 4 players. We found that at 4 players, so you have a starting wizard. At 4 players, somebody gets a wizard that's not ideal for the team. And so we usually just play it with 3 people. But if one of the kids wants to play it, then it makes it 4, then we just make it 4, and then we do what we can to help the other person out. Let's see. One other thing that I've been playing with lately, I usually don't do too many deeply technical picks, but I've been playing a lot with Veet lately, and wow, it's magical. Like, I'd get lost managing Webpack or what have you. And so I didn't always love having to use Webpack. I switched over. Rails has import maps built in, and that mostly works most of the time. But what I found is that Veet gave me a couple of capabilities like hot module reloading and stuff that import maps just didn't quite. You didn't have it. And then some of the older libraries, their module setup just wasn't quite like, you had to play with it a little bit to get it to work. And Veet seems to just mostly work. So I've been pretty happy with that. I think that's all of the picks that I have. So let's go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks for coming, Bruce. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you both for having me and listening to me, and people on the other end of this whom I can't see, thank you too.
All right. Well, till next time, folks, Max out.